They called me Inconvenient. My son Michael, the boy whose fevers I'd cooled with damp cloths, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged with gentle hands, whose college tuition I'd paid for with years of overtime and scrimped pennies, uttered those words, not in anger, not in a heated moment of frustration, but with a cool, detached practicality, as if discussing a piece of furniture that no longer fit their newly acquired minimalist aesthetic. His wife, Serafina, a woman whose ambition gleamed brighter than any of her expensive, professionally whitened teeth, had nodded in agreement, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows raised in an expression of mild, almost bored condescension. I had become, it seemed, an inconvenient truth in their carefully constructed narrative of self-made success, a reminder of a past they were eager to shed, a past where my sacrifices had been the very bedrock of their present comfort. They'd moved into my small, paid-for cottage by the sea after Michael lost his high-flying city job, arriving with suitcases full of designer clothes and hearts full of self-pity. I'd welcomed them, of course, cooked for them, cleaned for them, listened to their endless litany of woes, my small pension stretching to cover their gourmet coffee habits, and Serafina's insistence on organic everything. For 2 long years I was their lifeline, their soft place to land, their unpaid therapist and domestic servant. Then the new job offer for Michael had materialized, even better than the last. Suddenly, my little cottage, once their refuge, became cramped. My quiet, predictable ways, once a comfort, became stifling. My presence, once a necessity, became an inconvenience. They didn't just plan to move out, they planned to move on, leaving me and my years of unquestioning support behind, like last season's fashion. But they forgot one crucial detail. While they were busy planning their ascent back to the glittering heights of their former lives, I was quietly assessing the landscape of my own, and the view from my inconvenient little cottage, the one they now so casually dismissed, was about to offer them a perspective on gratitude and consequence that they had clearly disastrously overlooked. This is how I showed them the true cost of calling a lifeline inconvenient. Now let me tell you what really happened. The first year after they arrived was a blur of carefully managed resources and even more carefully managed emotions on my part. Michael, once so confident, so full of swagger, was a shadow of his former self. His days spent listlessly scrolling through job sites, his evenings punctuated by heavy sighs and morose pronouncements about the unfairness of the corporate world. Serafina, who had never, to my knowledge, performed a single domestic chore in her adult life, treated my home like a slightly down-at-heel boutique hotel, expecting meals to appear, laundry to be done, and her every whim to be catered to with a smile. I did it all, of course. What mother wouldn't? I cooked nourishing, budget-friendly meals, stretching my pension to accommodate their surprisingly expensive tastes. I kept the house spotless, a calm oasis in the storm of their discontent. I listened patiently to Michael's endless recitations of his professional woes, to Serafina's complaints about the lack of decent artisanal cheese shops in our small coastal town. I bit back the retort that perhaps artisanal cheese was a luxury they could forego while living rent-free in their inconvenient mother's home. My own needs, my own quiet pleasures, my afternoon cup of tea in the garden, my weekly call with my sister, my precious hour of reading before bed, were gradually, insidiously, eroded. The garden became Serafina's preferred spot for her interminable yoga sessions, my quiet reading hour often interrupted by Michael's demand for a late-night snack, or Serafina's sudden need to debrief about the latest perceived slight from one of her former city friends. I became a silent, accommodating presence in my own life, my own home. Their gratitude, when it was expressed at all, was perfunctory, almost an afterthought. "Oh, thanks, Mom," Michael would mutter, his eyes already drifting back to his laptop screen. "This soup is fine." Serafina rarely bothered with even such faint praise. Her acknowledgments were usually limited to a critical appraisal of my efforts. "A bit too much salt in the stew tonight, don't you think, Agnes? Or these towels feel a little rough. Are you using a good fabric softener?" I swallowed my pride, my resentment, telling myself it was temporary, that they were under stress, that this was what family did, support each other in times of need. I reminded myself of the sacrifices Samuel and I had made for Michael's education, for his first apartment, for the down payment on the city penthouse they had so recently, and so spectacularly lost. This, I reasoned, was just an extension of that maternal duty. But as the months stretched into a year, then 2, a subtle shift began to occur. Not in them but in me. The constant erosion of my own space, my own peace, began to wear thin the thick cloak of my maternal forbearance. I started to notice, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, the true extent of their self-absorption, their casual disregard for my feelings, my contributions. It wasn't just that they were struggling, it was that they expected me to absorb the entirety of their struggle, to cushion their fall, without a single thought for my own well-being. The convenient lifeline, I was beginning to realize, was also an invisible one, taken for granted, easily dismissed once its immediate utility had passed. The first hint of their impending departure, and my subsequent demotion from lifeline to inconvenience, came not from them directly, but through a stray comment Serafina made during a phone call to one of her city friends, a call she took in my garden, her voice carrying clearly through my open kitchen window. "Oh, darling, the most fabulous news," she'd trilled. "Michael's landed that incredible new position. Yes, even better than the last one. We'll be back in the city by summer, thank God. I simply cannot endure another season in this cultural desert. And then finally, we can get our lives back on track, away from, well, certain obligations." Certain obligations. Me. I was the obligation, the cultural desert she was so desperate to escape. The words, so casually cruel, struck me with a force that left me breathless. I sank into a kitchen chair, the half-peeled potatoes for their dinner forgotten in my lap, and for the first time in 2 long years, I allowed myself to feel the full, unadulterated weight of my anger, my disappointment. The lifeline, it seemed, was about to be cut adrift, and I, the inconvenient old woman who had kept them afloat, was about to discover just how deep and how cold the waters of their ingratitude truly were. The transformation from essential support system to awkward impediment was swift and brutal. Once Michael's new job offer was confirmed, a high-powered 6-figure position with a corner office and all the accompanying perks he so desperately craved, the atmosphere in my small cottage changed overnight. The despondent sighs were replaced by excited chatter, the listless scrolling through job sites supplanted by animated discussions about apartment hunting in exclusive city neighborhoods, about new wardrobes, about re-establishing their rightful place in the glittering social hierarchy they had temporarily, and so reluctantly, vacated. My role in their lives, once that of a patient, accommodating, and largely invisible provider, now shifted to that of a slightly embarrassing, soon-to-be discarded piece of their past. Serafina, in particular, seemed to shed her carefully cultivated veneer of polite tolerance, revealing the sharp, dismissive core beneath. My cooking, once fine, was now a bit too rustic for their soon-to-be reclaimed sophisticated palates. My home, their refuge for 2 years, was suddenly impossibly small, terribly cluttered, and frankly, a little depressing. "Agnes, don't you think?" My presence, which they had so recently relied upon for their very survival, became an unspoken but palpable irritation. They started taking their meals in their room, emerging only to raid the refrigerator or to conduct loud, important-sounding business calls in my living room, their voices filled with a renewed, almost aggressive self-assurance. Conversations with me, if they happened at all, were brief, distracted, and usually centered around their exciting new future, a future in which I clearly had no part. It was during one such conversation, or rather monologue from Serafina, about the sheer impossibility of finding a decent 3-bedroom apartment in the city with good light and a private terrace, that the word was finally uttered. "Of course," she'd said, waving a dismissive hand. "Once we're settled, Michael will have to arrange for your ongoing care, Agnes. Obviously, you can't stay here alone indefinitely. It's just inconvenient at this stage of your life." Inconvenient. There it was. The label they had finally explicitly attached to me. Not mother, not lifeline, not even obligation. Just inconvenient. Michael, to his credit, had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. He mumbled something about making sure I was comfortable, about exploring options. But he didn't contradict her. He didn't defend me. He simply stared at his expensive Italian loafers, his silence a tacit, damning agreement. I said nothing. What could I say? The casual cruelty of it, the sheer breathtaking ingratitude, left me speechless. I retreated to my room, the word inconvenient echoing in my mind, a bitter, relentless refrain. For 2 years I had been their convenience, their safety net, their port in a storm. Now, with the storm past, and their ship sailing back into prosperous waters, I was to be jettisoned, a piece of inconvenient ballast. The injustice of it burned, a slow, steady fire in my chest. But beneath the anger, something else was stirring, a cold, hard resolve. They thought they could simply discard me, like an old, worn-out coat. They had forgotten, or perhaps never known, the strength that lay beneath my quiet, accommodating exterior. They had forgotten that this inconvenient old woman still owned the very roof over their heads, the roof they were now so casually planning to abandon. They had forgotten that sacrifices, unacknowledged and unappreciated, can curdle into a potent and entirely justifiable resentment. My mind, once clouded by a mother's reflexive, unquestioning love, was now startlingly clear. I saw them for what they were: selfish, entitled, and utterly devoid of genuine gratitude or affection. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would not allow them to write the final chapter of my story. If I was inconvenient, then so be it. I would become the most inconvenient, most unexpected, most thoroughly disruptive obstacle they had ever encountered. My quiet little cottage by the sea, their temporary refuge, was about to become the stage for a reckoning they would never forget. The planning began that very night. In the solitude of my small bedroom, the sound of their oblivious laughter drifting from the living room, a goad to my burgeoning resolve. My first call was to Eleanor Vance, not the lawyer from the previous story, but my late husband Samuel's shrewd, no-nonsense sister, a retired accountant with a mind like a steel trap and a deep-seated, if rarely expressed, skepticism regarding Seraphina's character. "Eleanor," I'd said, my voice low and urgent, "it's Agnes. I need your help. It's about Michael and Seraphina, and the house." Eleanor, bless her pragmatic soul, had listened without interruption as I laid out the situation: their 2-year occupancy, their sudden good fortune, their casual dismissal of me as an inconvenience, and their blithe assumption that they could simply walk away, leaving me to what? Fade into obscurity in my cramped little cottage. "The ungrateful little wretches," Eleanor had snorted when I finished. "Never did trust that Seraphina. All style and no substance, that one. And Michael? Well, he always was a bit weak-willed where a pretty face was concerned. So, what's the plan, Agnes? Are we selling the cottage and moving you into a luxury penthouse just to spite them?" I'd laughed. A genuine heartfelt laugh, the first in what felt like ages. "Not quite a penthouse, Eleanor," I'd said. "But selling the cottage, yes, I think that's exactly what we're going to do." The decision to sell the cottage, my home for over 40 years, the repository of so many precious memories of Samuel, was not one I made lightly. It felt like a betrayal of him, of us, of the life we had built together within those familiar walls. But the alternative, to remain there, a solitary, inconvenient old woman, haunted by the ghosts of their ingratitude, while they swanned off to their new glittering lives, was unbearable. No, the cottage, my sanctuary, had been tainted by their presence, by their casual cruelty. It was time for a fresh start, for me, and a rather rude awakening for them. Eleanor, with her accountant's precision, helped me map out the strategy. "First things first, Agnes," she'd said, "we need a proper valuation, and a good, aggressive estate agent. Someone who won't be intimidated by Seraphina's airs and graces if she tries to interfere." We found just the woman, a Miss Harriet Finch, a whirlwind of energy, with a reputation for closing deals quickly and for top dollar. Ms. Finch, after a thorough inspection of the cottage, during which Seraphina hovered, her expression a mixture of suspicion and disdain, delivered her verdict. "It's a charming property, Mrs. Carmichael," she'd said, her gaze shrewd. "Prime coastal location. Needs a bit of updating, perhaps, to appeal to the discerning modern buyer. Here," she'd shot a pointed look at Seraphina's expensive Italian handbag, "but it has excellent bones. We can get a very good price for this, especially in the current market." The discerning modern buyer. I almost smiled. The irony was delicious. Seraphina, who had so recently lamented the cottage's cultural desert status, now looked distinctly uneasy. The thought of strangers traipsing through her temporary refuge, assessing its, and by extension her value, clearly did not sit well. The for sale sign went up a week later, a bright, bold declaration of my intent. Michael and Seraphina were, to put it mildly, apoplectic. "Mother!" Michael had confronted me, his face flushed, his voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Selling the house? Without even consulting us?" "Consulting you, Michael?" I'd replied, my voice calm, my gaze steady. "Why would I consult you about the sale of my own property? A property you and Serafina were so eager to vacate, as I recall. A property you deemed inconvenient." Serafina, ever the dramatist, chimed in, her voice trembling with theatrical indignation. But where will you go, Agnes? You can't possibly manage on your own. This is just cruel. After all we've done for you, all you've done for me, Serafina," I'd countered, my voice like ice, "is occupy my home rent-free for 2 years, consume my resources, and treat me with a breathtaking lack of gratitude and respect. As for where I will go, that is my concern, not yours. Rest assured, however, I will be perfectly comfortable." Their attempts to dissuade me, to guilt-trip me, to manipulate me, were relentless. There were tearful appeals from Michael, "Mom, you're breaking my heart," thinly veiled threats from Serafina, "You'll regret this, Agnes. You'll end up old and alone," even an attempt to enlist Eleanor on their side, a move that backfired spectacularly when my sister-in-law, with her characteristic bluntness, informed them that she wholeheartedly supported my decision and considered them both to be ungrateful, grasping parasites. I remained unmoved. Miss Finch, bless her aggressive efficiency, began scheduling viewings. The cottage was suddenly filled with strangers, prospective buyers oohing and aahing over the sea views, the charming original features, the very features Serafina had been so eager to update, the potential for modernization. Michael and Serafina were forced to make themselves scarce during these viewings, a situation that clearly grated on their nerves. I overheard Serafina complaining bitterly to Michael one evening, "It's humiliating, Michael. Being turfed out of our own, out of Agnes's house, like squatters. And these people, poking through my things. Her things. In my house." The audacity never ceased to amaze me. The offers started coming in quickly. The coastal property market, it seemed, was indeed buoyant. Ms. Finch, a skilled negotiator, played them off against each other, driving the price steadily upwards. The final offer, from a young couple from the city looking for a weekend retreat, was significantly higher than even Ms. Finch's initial optimistic valuation. It was more than enough for me to secure a comfortable, well-appointed apartment in a reputable retirement village Eleanor had found for me, a place with a communal garden, a library, and most importantly, a sense of community, of companionship, something that had been so sorely lacking in my life for the past 2 years. And enough, also, for a rather substantial nest egg. A nest egg that would allow me to live out my remaining years in comfort and independence, beholden to no one. The closing date was set. Michael and Serafina were given formal notice to vacate. Their reign of entitled occupancy was officially over. The inconvenient old woman, it turned out, had a few rather inconvenient surprises of her own. The departure of Michael and Serafina from my cottage was, much like their arrival, an exercise in self-absorbed drama. There was no quiet dignity, no expression of gratitude for the 2 years of free lodging and board they had enjoyed. Instead, there was a flurry of resentful packing, muttered imprecations, and a general air of ill-used martyrdom. Serafina, in particular, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in highlighting the inconvenience of it all, sighing dramatically as she wrapped her expensive and largely unused crystal stemware, complaining loudly about the appalling lack of assistance from certain people, meaning me, presumably, as I remained resolutely ensconced in my room, offering neither help nor hindrance. Michael, for his part, oscillated between a sullen, resentful silence and outbursts of petulant anger, mostly directed at inanimate objects, though I suspected I was the true target of his frustration. "This is a disaster," I heard him roar one afternoon, after apparently dropping a box marked "Fragile," Serafina's ceramic cat collection. "Our lives are ruined, all because of her, me, the inconvenient old woman who had dared to reclaim her own life, her own property." The day before they were due to leave, a sleek black removal van, considerably smaller than the one that had arrived with their possessions 2 years prior, pulled up outside. Their temporary stay, it seemed, had not resulted in an accumulation of cherished memories, but rather a shedding of superfluous baggage, both literal and, I hoped, metaphorical. I watched from my window as they directed the movers, their faces grim, their movements jerky and irritable. There were no fond farewells to the cottage, No lingering glances at the sea view they had so recently claimed as their own, just a grim determination to be gone, to escape the scene of their unexpected and entirely self-inflicted defeat. On the final morning, after the van had departed, leaving behind a trail of discarded packing tape and a faint aroma of Serafina's expensive and rather cloying perfume, they made one last, perfunctory sweep of the now eerily empty cottage. I heard their footsteps in the hallway, their voices low and indistinct. Then, a knock on my door. It was Michael, alone. He looked tired, older than his years, the confident swagger entirely gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "We're leaving now, Mom," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Right," I replied, equally devoid of any sentiment I didn't feel. An awkward silence descended. He shuffled his feet, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond my shoulder. "Look, Mom," he began, then stopped, as if unsure how to continue. This whole thing, it's been difficult." Difficult. An interesting choice of word, I thought, for 2 years of calculated exploitation, followed by a well-deserved eviction. "Yes, Michael," I said. "It has been difficult for me." He had the grace to flush slightly. "Yeah, well, anyway, we're going. Serafina's waiting in the car." He paused, then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Take care of yourself, Mom," and then he was gone. No apology, no expression of remorse, no acknowledgement of the profound hurt he had caused, the trust he had shattered, just gone. I waited until I heard the sound of their car pulling away from the curb, its engine fading into the distance. Then, I slowly got up from my chair, walked out of my room, and stood in the empty living room of my cottage. It felt strange, lighter somehow, as if a heavy, oppressive weight had been lifted. The scent of Serafina's perfume still lingered, a faint, unwelcome reminder of their occupancy, but beneath it, I could almost discern the familiar, comforting aroma of sea salt and old wood, the true scent of my home. Miss Finch, the estate agent, arrived later that morning with the new owners, the young couple from the city, their faces alight with the joy of finally possessing their dream weekend retreat. They were charming, enthusiastic, full of plans for restoring the garden, for filling the cottage with laughter and light. I handed them the keys, my keys, with a sense of profound relief and a quiet, unshakable satisfaction. My inconvenience, it seemed, had proven to be rather more potent, rather more consequential than Michael and Serafina had ever anticipated. My new life, in my comfortable apartment at Eleanor's chosen retirement village, the Havenwood, awaited, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt not just a survivor, but a woman in complete and rather delightful control of her own destiny. Life at the Havenwood was a gentle unfolding, a quiet blossoming after a long, harsh winter. My small apartment, with its sunny balcony and views over the meticulously tended communal gardens, quickly began to feel like home. I filled it with my cherished books, Samuel's photographs, and the few pieces of furniture I had salvaged from the cottage, the ones Serafina hadn't deemed worthy of her updating or her subsequent resentful departure. The oppressive silence of my final months at the cottage, broken only by Michael and Serafina's discordant presence, was replaced by the cheerful hum of community life. There were morning coffee gatherings in the sun-drenched conservatory, afternoon bridge games in the well-appointed card room, evening lectures and film screenings in the small, cozy theater. I reconnected with old acquaintances, made new friends, women, and a few rather charming gentlemen, with rich, varied life stories, their companionship a warm, comforting presence. Eleanor, my sister-in-law, was a frequent visitor, her sharp wit and unwavering support a constant delight. We'd spend hours on my balcony, sipping tea, dissecting the latest village gossip, and occasionally, with a shared wry chuckle, reminiscing about Michael and Serafina's spectacular self-immolation. "Serves them right, the grasping little ingrates," Eleanor would declare, her eyes twinkling. "You played them beautifully, Agnes." Samuel would have been proud. Samuel. His memory was a gentle, constant presence, no longer tinged with the bitterness of my recent experiences, but with the warm glow of a love that had endured, a love that had given me the strength, perhaps, to finally stand up for myself. The proceeds from the sale of the cottage, combined with the modest inheritance Samuel had left me, provided a comfortable financial cushion. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was secure, independent, beholden to no one. It was a profound and deeply satisfying feeling. I indulged in small luxuries I had long denied myself: a subscription to my favorite literary journal, a new set of watercolor paints, the occasional leisurely lunch at the charming little bistro in the nearby village. I even, on Eleanor's insistence, bought myself a rather stylish new coat, a soft cashmere in a flattering shade of dove gray, a far cry from the inconvenient old cardigans Serafina had so disdained. Of Michael and Serafina, I heard very little, and frankly I sought no news. Eleanor, through her network of contacts, had ascertained that they were living in a cramped, overpriced rental apartment in a less than salubrious part of the city, their dreams of a triumphant return to their former glittering lifestyle presumably on indefinite hold. Michael, she'd heard, was struggling in his new job, the pressures apparently more intense, the rewards less forthcoming than he had anticipated. Serafina, deprived of her accustomed luxuries and her sense of social superiority, was reportedly not coping well. I felt a flicker of something akin to pity, perhaps, but it was a distant, detached emotion, quickly superseded by a profound sense of relief that their drama was no longer my own. My days were filled with simple pleasures, tending the small collection of herbs and flowers on my balcony, losing myself in the pages of a good book, engaging in lively discussions with my new friends at the book club, even, to my surprise, discovering a latent talent for lawn bowls on the Havenwood's impeccably manicured green. One afternoon, as I was enjoying a particularly vigorous, and I might add victorious game of bowls, a young woman approached me, a hesitant smile on her face. She was one of the care assistants at the Havenwood, a sweet-natured girl named Lucy, not much older than Serafina. "Mrs. Carmichael," she said, her voice soft. "There's a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Michael Carmichael. He says he's your son." My heart gave a small, unexpected lurch. Michael. Here. After all this time, what could he possibly want? My carefully constructed peace felt suddenly, precariously threatened. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and handed my lawn bowl to Eleanor, who was regarding me with a shrewd, questioning gaze. "Duty calls, it seems," I said, my voice lighter than I felt. "Wish me luck." As I walked towards the main reception area, a familiar anodyne tune playing softly in the background, I wondered what new chapter of this unwelcome family saga was about to unfold. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain: the inconvenient old woman he had so casually dismissed was no more. In her place stood Agnes Carmichael, a woman in full possession of her faculties, her finances, and her own unshakable sense of worth. And she was not about to be played for a fool again. Michael was waiting in the small chintz-furnished visitors' lounge, looking ill at ease and considerably more careworn than I remembered. The expensive suit he wore seemed a size too big, the confident swagger replaced by a slumped, almost defeated posture. He stood up awkwardly as I entered, his gaze shifting, unable to meet mine directly. "Mom," he said, his voice low, almost a mumble. "Thanks for seeing me." I gestured to one of the armchairs. "Michael, this is unexpected." We sat in a strained silence for a moment, the ticking of the carriage clock on the mantelpiece the only sound. Finally he spoke. "Look, Mom," he began, his voice gaining a little strength. I know things ended badly between us, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry. An apology. After all this time, it was almost anticlimactic. "Sorry for what, Michael?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "For everything," he said, waving a vague hand. "For the way things were at the cottage. You mean for taking my home, spending my money, and treating me like an unwanted piece of luggage?" I clarified, my tone sharper than I intended. He winced. "Yeah, that. Look, Mom, Serafina and we're not together anymore." This, I confess, was a surprise. "Oh? She left me," he said, his voice flat. "Took most of what was left. Said she couldn't handle the downgrade in lifestyle. Said I'd ruined her life." The irony was almost too much to bear. Serafina, the architect of so much of my own misery, now a victim of her own shallow values. "I'm sorry to hear that, Michael," I said, and to my surprise I realized I meant it, in a distant, detached sort of way. No one deserved to be abandoned. Not even someone as self-absorbed as Serafina. "Yeah, well," he shrugged, a flash of his old bitterness surfacing. "It is what it is. Anyway, Mom, the reason I'm here, I'm in a bit of a bind. Lost my job again. The new one, it didn't work out, And, well, I'm pretty much broke. I was wondering, just until I get back on my feet, if maybe I could, He trailed off, his gaze finally meeting mine, a desperate pleading look in his eyes. The audacity of it. After everything. After the callous disregard, the financial exploitation, the profound disrespect. He was here, cap in hand, expecting me, the inconvenient old woman, to once again be his lifeline, his soft place to land. I looked at him, really looked at him, my son, the boy I had loved, the man he had become, and I felt not anger, not even pity, but a profound, unutterable weariness. Michael, I said, my voice quiet but firm, you seem to be under a misapprehension. The Bank of Mom, as you and Serafina so clearly viewed it, is permanently closed. Its assets have been reallocated. He stared at me, his mouth agape. What do you mean? I mean, Michael, I said, that my finances are my own, and they will remain so. You made your choices. You burned your bridges. And now, I'm afraid you must live with the consequences. I stood up, a signal that the audience was over. I wish you well, Michael. I truly do. I hope you find your way. But you will not find it here, at my expense. I walked out of the lounge, leaving him sitting there, stunned, amidst the chintz and the scent of lavender potpourri, the echo of my words, my final irrevocable refusal, hanging in the air. As I walked back towards the bowling green, where Eleanor was waiting, a triumphant grin already spreading across her face, I felt a lightness, a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. The inconvenient old woman had spoken her last word on the matter, and it was, unequivocally, no. My legacy, my peace, my future, they were mine, and mine alone. And they were, I realized with a deep, quiet satisfaction, more valuable than any sum of money Michael could ever have imagined. The encounter with Michael, his pathetic plea for a bailout, served as a final, definitive punctuation mark on that sorry chapter of my life. It wasn't a moment of triumph, not in the traditional sense. There was no gloating, no desire to see him suffer further, but there was a profound, almost serene sense of justice, of scales finally, irrevocably balanced. My refusal to rescue him, to once again become his safety net, was not an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation, and perhaps, in a strange way, an act of tough love. He needed to learn, however belatedly, that actions have consequences, that responsibility cannot be endlessly deferred or offloaded onto others. Whether he would ever truly learn that lesson remained to be seen, but it was no longer my concern. My focus now was on my own life, my own well-being, the quiet joys and gentle rhythms of my days at the Havenwood. Eleanor and I became an inseparable duo, the grandames of the green, as one of our fellow bowlers cheekily dubbed us. We traveled, not to exotic, far-flung locales, but to nearby historical towns, charming seaside villages, National Trust gardens bursting with color. We attended lectures, joined a surprisingly lively local history society, and even, in a moment of shared recklessness, signed up for a beginner's Italian class, our attempts to conjugate verbs usually dissolving into helpless laughter. My watercolor painting, once a hesitant exploration, blossomed into a genuine passion. I found a quiet joy in capturing the fleeting beauty of a sunset over the communal gardens, the intricate patterns of a seashell found on a beach walk, the character in the weathered face of a fellow Havenwood resident. My small apartment became a gallery of my efforts, each painting a small testament to a life reclaimed, a spirit reawakened. The haven for young mothers, the primary beneficiary of my revised will, became another quiet focus. I didn't want to be a distant, anonymous benefactor. I visited, met the young women and their children, listened to their stories of struggle and resilience. I didn't offer advice, unless asked, but I offered a listening ear, a comforting presence, and occasionally, a batch of my signature oatmeal raisin cookies, which were always, gratifyingly, devoured with gusto. Knowing that my life savings, Samuel's legacy, would one day contribute to offering these young families a chance at a brighter future, a chance to build lives free from the hardship and despair that so many of them had known, brought me a profound sense of peace, a sense of purpose that transcended my own personal dramas. Of Michael and Serafina, I heard only whispers, echoes from a life I had thankfully left behind. Michael, it was rumored, was working a low-level administrative job, his dreams of corporate glory long since faded. Serafina, according to Eleanor's ever-reliable sources, had remarried, a wealthy but reportedly rather dull widower twice her age, her pursuit of a comfortable lifestyle apparently undiminished, if somewhat less discerning. I felt no bitterness towards them anymore, only a distant, almost clinical detachment. They were characters in a play that had long since ended, their roles in my life concluded. My final act was my own to write, and I was determined to fill it with kindness, with creativity, with friendship, with the quiet, unshowy dignity of a life well lived, on my own terms. The inconvenient old woman had found her convenience, not in the fleeting approval of her entitled offspring, but in the enduring comfort of her own strength, her own resilience, her own hard-won and deeply cherished peace. And that, I knew, was a legacy far more valuable, far more lasting, than any sum of money, any piece of property, any worldly possession they could ever have hoped to inherit. My life was my own, and it was, finally, beautifully, blessedly, convenient.